Hello and welcome back to the NOTCAST number 410. I think today is Sunday, 13th of October, 2024. I've not done one of these for a few days on the grounds. When I started doing these, it was a replacement for my social life in the middle of COVID, which was 4 years ago. And since then, obviously, the world has snapped back into a kind of place. COVID hasn't gone away. And this now kind of exists as a kind of side hustle. Terrible word, side hustle, because it doesn't make me any money alongside the rest of my life. And obviously, I don't need to replace my social life because I've got one. Now, that sounds showing off, but I've been out. I was out 5 nights in 5 nights, so I was out 5 nights in a row. Plus, I saw Pop yourself last week. This week, I saw Public Service Broadcasting and David Gilmour. Next week, I've got David Gilmour again. And so there's been a gap because I've been doing stuff in the so-called real world, whatever that is like. Today, I am going to be talking about Pulp's 1994 studio record, 30 years ago already, his and hers, and about what it was like to be like 19, 20, 21 in that period of time, what life was like and kind of what just happened around the whole thing of Britpop, because in the next 12 months, there's going to be a whole load of Britpop stuff going on across popular culture. People are going to be talking about, Oasis, they're touring, and Blur are going to do something, undoubtedly another live record or something. Pulp might release another album, their first one in 23, 24 years. Who knows? But what we do know is that 30 years from now, the world is, more correctly, next year, the world is going to be full of people talking about what it was like 30 years ago. I don't remember in 1996 people talking about the summer of 1966, for example. Nostalgia has become this huge thing in culture. Bands reforming, releasing albums, carrying on. And to one extent, that's absolutely fascinating to see people change, grow and evolve over time. Certainly the versions of Jarvis and Nick Banks, which exist there, don't exist anymore, in the same way that the version of me that existed 30 years ago don't exist anymore. The relationships that I had then, I don't tend to have now. The place where I live, I don't have the career that I had. I don't have, everything has changed since you've been to London, the southern wonderland, as Kingmaker sang on one of their marvellous B-sides. The B-side to Armchair Anarchist, actually, Ladies and Jelly Spoons, just in case you were wondering. So, Nick Banks, in this fabulous book, So It Started There, suggests that perhaps the thing that made all the difference with Pulp was a pair of contact lenses. Now, that's a strange way to look at it. It really, really is. But I think it really ties into the sense of identity that runs all through his and hers like a stick of rock. So, released in 11th of April 1994 and finished in February 1994. His and Hers, which I think was Pulp's 5th album, if you include intro, was, I think, one of the times where it was a moment where there was a confluence of events where suddenly a band that had been working in one direction and travelling one particular path suddenly coincided with something else that was happening. And so Pulp didn't change necessarily. They just aligned with the world that was around them. And certainly for me, who was a spotty, gawky indie kid with a full head of hair at university in Leicester, or Leicester, depending on who you talk to about it, I was experiencing that. I was buying the CDs, my girlfriend was buying the CDs and the albums and so on, and obviously when we split up I had to go and buy my own copies. One of the things people never talk about when you split up with somebody, obviously back then you had to go and buy copies of the CDs, and there were some songs you couldn't listen to because they belonged to them. Nowadays it's all Spotify. Now that makes me sound like Grandpa Simpson, but maybe I am. I'm not a grandpa, so I can't be that. His and Hers is an album that I think really captures a moment in time, a huge moment, and that moment is the time when the world changed in its own way. If you look at the chronology of contemporary bands, obviously Suede had been popular for a couple of years. Blur were just surfacing with Modern Life is Rubbish. Pulp had already garnered a lot of attention with the intro, Razzmatazz, Babies, OU singles, and dimly in the background somewhere was a band called Oasis that some people heard of that looked like a kind of, if you had ordered the Stone Roses off Temu. But there you are, and that was how it was really. So this was, you know, one of the progenitors of what was later somewhat unpleasantly or perhaps distastefully called Britpop. It was also regarded as, I think, something called the Crimpoline scene by some people, not necessarily me, which was a non-existent scene. It was funded by necessity for people that I think felt marginalised and dispossessed, misshaped misfits, based on a diet of broken biscuits. People that didn't necessarily feel like they fit into the world. I mean, I felt very alienated from the world in 1993, 1994, and this was something that came all through his and hers, right down to the note on the back of the LP here: deliver us from matching sweatshirts and chicken in the rough, from evenings sat on Couple Row admiring the flock, from Sundays spent parading the aisles of Meadowhall, which by the way is a huge shopping centre in Sheffield. We don't want to live like this. It's bad for our health. Do something soon, or it's curtains, just as long as they match with the walls and the sofa. The idea, his and hers, is like, you know, the bit where I love Karen and I love Sharon is written on the window screen, as Morrissey sang in Dagenham Dave. The idea of you know, people being two halves of a whole, a matching pair. And with that idea of his and hers, it gives you the idea of conformity or uniformity or having your individualism kind of crushed out of you and flattened by the conveyor belt of life. And so it was almost like a refutation of that. Is, you know, deliver us from matching sweatshirts and chicken in the rough. Exactly. That kind of sense of, well, actually, you have to be the best you that you can be. You have to be an individual. You can't be anybody else. There's no point being anybody else. Everyone else is already taken. And for me as well, I felt like I didn't fit into the world. I still feel like I don't. I still feel like I'm a KGB, well, not KGB actually, but a secret agent operating in a world where everybody else is very, very different. Kind of like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where you know you're different and you just look like everybody else, and your job is to mask and to look like other people and act like other people. I still don't know why Mrs. Brown's Boys gets commissioned every year. I mean, surely that should be reported to Geneva and breach some kind of war crime about cruel and unusual punishment. But the idea of conformities, I wasn't interested in the things that were in the newspapers or on the radio. I certainly didn't give a shit about Simply Red, golf, football, or, you know, any of that stuff. That's not to be snobby. You know, that stuff delivers great joy to lots of people, but not me. I just look at it and go, no, not me. Doesn't work for me. Doesn't have whatever it is that I need. And what I needed was to be able to have a kind of like, not an ironic detachment, but almost like a distance from life, and to go, I know this is a game. It's absurd. You know it's a game too. Let's just stop pretending and be who we are. And that's one of the things that his and hers was about. There was also the scene was drawn and made out of necessity. You know, people didn't necessarily have a huge amount of money, so you were going to second-hand shops, you were buying old pairs of jeans from people that had died, that had then been donated to the British Heart Foundation. You were going to, you know, buying shirts like this because you certainly couldn't afford £140 for a shirt, because £140 was what you needed to live on for a month. You know, so people were buying expensive shirts and expensive pairs of jeans, and they were doing it to prove that, yeah, they could afford it. They had money. Now, that's a bit considerably richer than Yao, to quote Harry Enfield's New Money sketch. But at the same point, you know, I was far more interested in experiences, and I didn't have enough money to waste on things like that. So, I mean, I remember my first pay packet was £693, for example. So effectively I was paid, what, £20 a day or something. And even inflation adjusted, that was pretty meagre, all things considered. I had to be an expert at stretching the period where I had too much month at the end of my money. And so therefore buying secondhand things, buying old shirts that didn't look like everybody else, that probably belonged to somebody that's now died in a nursing home or a hospice, for example. These were all things and cultural decisions that were made. And so Pulp were doing that as well. Although it was called the Crimpoline scene, Suede were doing it as well. They were buying clothes that looked good on a budget that were probably out of fashion, because they were out of fashion anyway. They couldn't participate. They created their own world and their own universe. And this is where I pick up what Nick Banks said about a pair of contact lenses, which is in here. He says Pulp's rise to fame coincided with the moment where Jarvis got contact lenses, because before that, Jarvis was wearing these things, glasses, specs. These are traditionally known in the UK as NHS specs. Now they're kind of retro, and they remind you of things like Michael Caine, for example. But certainly up to about 2007, 2008, sorry, when people saw these glasses, they thought that they were NHS specs, and that meant that you were poor and you didn't have any money, so you got bullied for having them. Nowadays, it's cool and retro, man. I've been wearing glasses like this since I was approximately 8, so I don't really care about that. To quote Oscar Wilde, fashion is what I'm wearing. Well, maybe this isn't. But that's not how it was, you know. When Jarvis took the glasses off, because remember, glasses aren't very rock and roll, suddenly Pulp's fortunes changed. He went from being this specky, gawky geek into some kind of cool Lothario of the working class. And there's a stigma to wearing glasses. The idea is if you wear glasses, you can't be very rock and roll, you can't be very sexy, you're probably a bit of a geek, you probably like books more. There's more to life than books, you know, but not much more. Probably listen to the Smiths. And there's also that phrase that girls don't make passes at guys that wear glasses. Now, as a man, a guy who's been wearing glasses for a very long time, I can confirm this is not actually true, but I'd rather not have to produce scientific paper and evidence about that. We had a situation where suddenly Pulp was seen less as the outsiders because Jarvis stitched a pair of glasses. Crazy when you think about it, but there you are. This was an accidental alignment of everything. You know, the UK has started to turn against, for example, the self-pity of Nirvana. No matter how good Nirvana were, and undoubtedly have aged very, very well, there was always an element of self-loathing inside Nirvana, and Pulp, and to an extent Suede, Oasis definitely, a little bit of Blur felt like a celebration of the unique quirkiness of Britishness. And even though the songs were touched with an underpinning melancholy, especially for Suede and Pulp, who, by the way, are the top two in Britpop. When people go Oasis or Blur, I go, no, Suede and Pulp. Always, always, always. But the idea is that there's a celebration in that, a kind of not a misery about it, but a recognition that with incredible highs come incredible lows. And that's the only way it can really be. In April 1993, Select magazine put their Britpop Now issue out, which had Brett Anderson of Suede with the Union Jack Photoshop behind him. And Pulp managed to finally extricate themselves from the incompetent hands of Fire Records, did some work under Gift, which became the Gift and intro album, and finally signed with Island. And because they'd been going for 10 years before that success had happened, as a band, and you can see this with some other bands that have been touring for a little while, is they don't take it for granted. They appreciate what they've got and they approach it with a maturity that embeds them with a long period of stability. Carter USM had it because both Jim Bob and Fruitbat had been in bands for several years before Carter became successful. Pulp, as Jarvis has said, I misspent my youth in a crap retro band when I could have had a proper job, and in July 1993 signed to Island Records. And with that success and that maturity that came with it, having been struggling for many, many years as a band, Russell had been in the band since I think 1984, Candida had been 1984, Nick about 1986, Steve there, God rest your soul, Steve, since about 1987, and Jarvis obviously since 1981. They'd had 12 years of failure, so they knew exactly what they were experiencing, and they decided they were going to take that chance, grab it, take it, and run with it. So they started after signing with Island in July 1993 and started to show the signs of what they were already up to. Thankfully, this here, the 2006 reissue of His and Hers, has some embryonic pre-album recordings on, so it has Live On and Space. So Live On, I think, is from a Mark Goodyear session in 1992. And in 1992, by the way, the band had started playing Babies, which obviously is going to become the big single from His and Hers. Live On, which is available in a radio session version on the 2 CD, a version of She's a Lady, and a track called Glass, which I think turned into something else. Possibly, let me just quickly check. Might have been Pink Love, actually. I can't quite remember. But these songs were songs that you could start to hear a kind of amalgam and a combination of sequences, disco, kind of like New Order and the Smiths were kind of making out underneath a street lamp. That's the kind of sound that we had, and it was glorious, and nobody else was really doing it. You know, the vast majority of indie bands in the UK, at least, were either lumpenly trying to emulate the Wonder stuff on guitars, but not being anywhere near so good. Yeah, I'm looking at you, most bands signed on Food Records, or they were kind of going completely the other way entirely and trying to sound like some kind of, bootleg Nirvana from Aberdeen in Scotland as opposed to Aberdeen in Washington. This meant that Pulp were pretty much alongside Saint Etienne and Suede on their own in the world and creating a new environment that was more exciting, more interesting, and dirtier than anything else. So, you know, for example, Giorgio Moroder and Donna Summer when they're singing I Feel Love, that's all wonderful. But these songs are about, you know, the sounds and towns and places that I recognised growing up in Birmingham and growing up in Britain in the 90s. You know, tight terraced houses, small roads, car parks, the television chip shops, all those type of things. Those are the things I recognise. So if I watched an American film or listened to an American band and they were called Pavement, for example, or they were called Sidewalk or something, and they were talking about, you know, trucks and roads and being miserable and stuff, and I'm like, I don't recognise that world. When I watch an American film, for example, and it's shot in Chicago, I go, that will never, ever look like Manchester, no matter how much somebody tries. Not even Prague looks like America, despite the tax breaks making it more attractive to film in Prague. And watching an American film pretending to be set in America where they've CGI'd the road signs and you go, I've walked down that street in Prague. It is not all that. The architecture is different. The world is different. Even the rain is different in America, and the sunshine and all that type of stuff. So I was listening to Pulp and going, that's the world I recognise. That's not an abstract world that I've been taught by, you know, movies and books and The Exorcist and All the President's Men and stuff. That's a road that I've walked down. That's a place that I've been. So when people were talking about the Meadow Hall, I've driven past that on a motorway. I know exactly what the Meadow Hall is. And now I've been in there, I'm, underwhelmed. I think it took me until 2019 to go there, actually. But it was a world that I recognised, and a world that perhaps Britain started to think, the cultural homogeny of something like Nirvana was pretty dull, really. So they started off, Pulp, with the Mark Goodyear session in 1992, and then they did a Mark Radcliffe session in 1993, and then they played Lip Gloss and Have You Seen Her Lately, His and Hers, and I think they played Joyriders as well, actually. I could be wrong. And you kind of go, okay, so that's more the world that we know. That's more the world that we recognise. And recorded demos with Stephen Street. Stephen Street produced Blur. He produced The Smiths. Was Morrissey's co-writer for a number of years. And they recorded Lip Gloss and You're Not Blind. The demo of You're Not Blind is track 2 on the expanded edition there, alongside a cover version of a song which I've never actually pronounced. Which was, I think, translates as Walk with the Ants into French. So this is where any French teachers watching this are going to be appalled by my accents. Paul Nacleros de Formis, I believe, which could be wrong. Almost definitely is. But that's like hearing somebody pronounce it as Wednesday. Getting it wrong. The first release from Ireland, the first single, was Lip Gloss. And You've Lost Your Lip Gloss, Holly. This I think I first saw on MTV's 120 Minutes on a Sunday night. And the band had been touring a lot. They've been playing small venues. It's slowly getting bigger ones. Lip Gloss is brilliant, actually. Fantastic. Only got to number 50 in the charts. Which, considering you can have like 12 Ed Sheeran songs in the top 10 at the moment, is pretty surprising. It's backed with You're a Nightmare, which is a Peel session, and that Peel session of You're a Nightmare is released on this 2006 companion to the reissue album. So they did Island in 2006, put out 2 CD editions of His and Hers, This Is Hardcore, and Different Class, not We Love Life, which seems cruel and unusual punishment, but presumably it didn't sell enough. And then the BBC, and alongside in conjunction with Ireland, put out the 2006 double CD of the Peel sessions, and this features the 1993 versions of Pink Love, You're a Nightmare, and Acrylic Afternoons as well. So there were lots of Pulp radio sessions going around at this point. Even getting radio sessions was a big deal, because obviously you were being broadcast into the homes of literally millions of people, because there was only 4 or 5 TV channels and maybe 6 radio stations, plus your local one that always played the bingo to listen to. So there wasn't much to listen to unless you already owned it. So getting a Peel session or a Mark Radcliffe session was a BFD, and it was one to be savoured. So the version of You're a Nightmare, which is on here, is also on there. But if you need to get the expanded editions of those albums, you do need to pick up the Peel Sessions double CD as well. And Lip Gloss then, topped at number 50, and it's also backed with a track called Deep Fried in Kelvin, which is amazing and different. Deep Fried in Kelvin is a 10-minute, one-note spoken word jam of the band, in which Jarvis intones about something, I don't know what. But more importantly, I think at this point the band had also started to put manifestos in their singles and on their CD singles. This says, "Welcome to the new era. We might look rough, but we've got beautiful insides, and everything's going to be all right, just so long as you mind the low-flying televisions." There is a sarcastic, mocking approach to the contemporary kind of future which had been mapped out for lots of us. When I went to the careers advisor, he told me I'd probably be a local photocopier salesman, or I could get a job at the local car factory, chocolate factory, or the HP sauce factory, where the chimney was in the shape of a HP sauce bottle. I didn't do those routes, but those were the routes that were laid out to us. And so those were the routes that Pulp were kicking against, and saying you don't have to accept the version of reality that's presented to you, and we're going to peel back the curtain and show you what that version of reality really looks like. And so these are songs where the lyrics are about tangible feelings and experiences, and not abstract concepts, the stars in your eyes, or going on the ride on the fairgrounds, or all of that asinine, nonsensical love is all around rubbish, where you feel it in your fingers and you feel it in your toes and you feel it when the wind blows, and la da 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 da. I hate wet, 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 as does Jarvis, as we will soon find out. But this was almost like a mainstream kind of issue, or an envelope, a transmission going, actually, not everyone is on board with the life that they're being given here. We want something a little bit different. Obviously, these days you can go to Twitter and fall down a rabbit hole and end up starting to talk about how gay rabbits are going to make you lose your sense of smell within about half an hour. But at this point, that was still pretty radical stuff that was going on. It only got to number 50. But number 50 in the charts meant it got played on the chart show. It meant that the band could play bigger places, and they were on the ascendant, which was the first time that anything had happened. And when they moved from Gift and Fire through to Ireland, they did a couple of key things that kept the lineage going. They kept Scott Peering from Savage and Best, and they kept their links to playing smaller underground venues, probably because not that many people actually wanted to see them, but also working with producers that they know would be sympathetic to their sound. I mean, you could go in and you could see, I don't know, Chris Thomas, for example, who'd produce the Sex Pistols, and probably REO Speedwagon, and I don't know, some band called Buffy and the Bandit, who knows. But no, they wanted to work with people that made records that sounded like them, if that made sense. The idea or role of a producer is not to bend a band out of reality, but to help them realise the full potential that they've got, which should always happen. And bad producers, yes, Rick Rubin, I'm looking at you, you're a bad producer, don't do that at all. They don't push back, they don't understand the sound, they don't understand the band. And of course, if all you've got is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Not a 9-inch nail, just a nail. And so His and Hers was completed in February, 14th of February 1994, Valentine's Day. And they'd finished the recordings with Ed Bueller in early 1994. Ed had produced the Suede album. It was then to go on to produce Suede's Dogman Star, and some other work. And according to what Nick said, it was everything that the band had ever wanted. They'd also had the opportunity to do what they regarded as to be the best parts of the band, which is not the song, but the things which aren't the song that make the song the song. Texture. So you think about Ed worked with the band closely to make sure that they had all the ha 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 and the little yelps and the weird and unusual keyboard arpeggios, all the things that stick in your mind that make the song feel more human and more interesting than just a 4x4 song called Common People about having sex with poor people. That's where it came from. And it was then followed up. The first, the immediate single that preceded the album was Do You Remember the First Time? Also, by the way, memorably covered by one of Britain's finest songstresses, Sophie Ellis-Bextor. And Do You Remember the First Time is a song that addresses one of the very, very few things that pretty much everybody experiences and hardly anybody talks about, which is the moment that you lose your virginity. And it was accompanied by a 30-minute film that is on Pulp's Greatest Hits DVD, which is a documentary where they talk to people, both famous, infamous and not famous, about the first time that they had sex. And I'm not going to tell you about the first time I had sex. Some of you would probably find it hard to believe that I've ever had sex, but it was talking about the experiences. And as the questions go, well, do you? And why did you choose them? Was it the drink or the time of year or the position of the planets, or was it just their hair? And I haven't seen that documentary in a long time, but it's a really fascinating way of approaching an intimate subject which hardly anybody talks about, which is how do you find the relationships that you're in, and what relationships are you in, and you know, do you go into some of them knowing they're not going to last, and so on and so forth. How does that work? And it's a great little song. Do you remember the first time? The only thing about Do You Remember the First Time that I would change is that I'd make it the first track on this album. It shouldn't be side 2, track 2. It should be side 1, track 1. And whilst you can't listen to the lyrics, or more correctly, well, you can't read the lyrics whilst listening to the recordings, you know, Do You Remember the First Time has this wonderful lyric about, oh God, it's 8:30, you'll be late, and about how intimacy starts, and about how you might have somebody at home who's waiting for you. There's a double entendre in the, oh God, it's 8:30, you'll be late, is obviously if you miss your period, you're late. And people say, I'm late. And that means, oh God, am I going to have a baby? You know, save us from, you know, chicken in the rough and, matching sweatshirts. But there's also, you say you've never been sure that it makes good sense for you to be together. And that talks, and the lyrics are brilliant in this album. Talk about, for example, if you're in a relationship, but it might not be a relationship, it's more of a partnership, it's not necessarily romantic, but then you go, well, it makes good sense to be together. It could be a viable business proposition. It could be that you've got somebody who's with you who can, you know, be a friend throughout everything, and you know, those type of things, as opposed to having, you know, the wind blowing through your hair and having Leonardo DiCaprio cup you from behind and so on. And sometimes people do get married because, well, it makes good business sense to be together. I could inherit a castle. I went on a date once where somebody asked me in the first 20 minutes how much money I earned, and then I could mentally see them totting up what their combined earning power was going to be and the quality of holidays that we're going to have. And I'm like, no, that's absolutely not what it's about. You know, a relationship, when done well, is about how you feel, and about how that person makes you feel, and do you feel safe, as opposed to, are you a good investment opportunity in a romantic concept? And Do You Remember the First Time is just one of the, you know, the greatest songs that I think Pulp ever did. And then there's that line about, I can't remember a worse time. Well, frankly, apparently the first time people have sex and lose their virginity, it sounds like it just fell down the back of the sofa, is rubbish. Mine was. I remember that, but that's about as far as I'm going into it, really. They do say that practice makes perfect, although I don't think I'm at that stage. And then there's this idea of, do you remember the first time? It's not just about that, but it's also about the first time that you're intimate with someone, about the decision that you make in your mind that goes from, oh, I quite like this person, to, okay, so I'm going to be intimate with this person. And then the element of also going, well, actually, you know, maybe it isn't forever, but for now is sometimes good enough. And there's that line in there it says, I don't care if you screw him as long as you leave a piece for me. And you say you've got to go home, well, at least there's someone there that you can talk to, and you never have to face up to the night on your own. Jesus, it must be great to be straight. And the idea of being straight, both in terms of a sexuality, which is obviously heterosexuality, but also straight as in terms of being bland, boring, conventional, vanilla. And that in itself is quite something. Fabulous lyric. Do you remember the first time? Possibly the best number 33 single of all time. Staggered it didn't do better, but the world, the Pulp had gone into the future and the world was still racing to catch up. Do you remember the first time was backed with two songs? One was Streetlights, which is effectively, I think it's a sequel to Inside Susan, the story in three parts, because it's kind of like the fourth part of the Susan trilogy, if that makes sense. And it's also backed with a track called The Babysitter, which could at one point have been... no, actually, The Babysitter is Susan Part 4, Streetlights isn't. Sorry, I was wrong there. But it wouldn't be the first time, would it, that I've been wrong about something. Then, 11th of April, 1994, His and Hers came out. And this changed the world. You may not have thought it, but without this, there wouldn't have been Common People, there wouldn't have been Pulp, there wouldn't have been Jarvis, there wouldn't have been Cunts and Running the World, there wouldn't have been any of that. This is a fabulous album, and it's only ever existed in a post-Kurt world, if that makes sense. You know, Kurt Cobain died. I think his body was found on the 10th or 11th. And then this came out, and that was it. I think this might have come out on the Monday after Kurt's body was discovered. And so suddenly there was this moment where Pulp was suddenly everywhere. So, for example, Hole didn't play Glasgow Sound City. They were due to play. Pulp replaced them. A year later, Pulp replaced the Stone Roses at Glastonbury. Pulp were a band that if you needed somebody to come in and play and be amazing, they were there. They stepped into a void that had been created by events that were outside of their control. And this is one of the albums that really kind of made a huge difference, where this was the moment, really, for the band, where the world aligned and suddenly they were on a runway and they took every opportunity that was ahead of them because they thought, we may only get one chance to do this. We're going to do it and we're going to see how far we can go with this. Because frankly, after seeing how crap some of the bands that got into the charts were, the idea that there was a good band that was in the charts, they were not going to let that chance go. And I mean, Jarvis went on game shows and he went on things like that. And one of the reasons behind that was, well, who else is going to go on them if not him? You'll end up with, I don't know, I was going to say Rick Witter from Shed 7, but you'd end up with somebody that was, monosyllabic, like the guy from the Ordinary Boys who walked off when he was on Nevermind the Buzzcocks or something. You go, no, Jarvis would be really, really good at this. He'd be much better at it than a lot of people. So if he's on the show, he's going to be good. And, he gave good value, is I think what he was once described as. And, sorry, I got distracted by a cat. And that's why suddenly, people going, he's really funny, I'm going to listen to his songs. And so then you get to a lyric, which, like, have you seen her lately? I don't know if you've seen her lately, but Christ, she's looking rough. Which I still quote to this day when talking about some of my exes. And it's just one of these albums that was just in the perfect place at the perfect time. The concept of simultaneous discovery, it was made and created outside of the mainstream, and then suddenly, almost like one of those guard lights in The Great Escape, it kind of passes over and it just hit the band at the time, aligned with where the world wanted to go. Even Kurt Cobain couldn't stand being Kurt Cobain anymore, but Pulp somehow were going, okay, so this world really, it's grotty, it's dirty, it's got buses and trains and smoke and fish and chip shops, but it's ours, and we're going to celebrate that and make the most of that. And certainly if you grew up in a suburb or a terrace in Britain, that's how you felt. The idea of someone who's a multimillionaire saying they hate themselves and they want to die, you're sat there going, I am not a multimillionaire and I don't hate myself and life is pretty crappy. And there was not a huge amount of sympathy for Kurt Cobain's death. I think Liam called him a loser that couldn't take it or something, which was very unsympathetic. But at the same point, whilst depression is real, and I often experience it, at the same point, from an objective material perspective, the people that were buying His and Hers were not rich. We were not well off. We were not vastly stylish. We felt shut out and excluded from popular culture. We felt that the world was something that seemed to happen to somebody else. TV barely touched us. Books didn't really talk to us. The only things that really did were bands like Pulp. There was this whole world of arena rock that had literally nothing to do with these bands at all. They play arenas now. They definitely didn't play arenas then, as people kind of grew up and realised what they'd missed out on. Joyriders, the first song, shouldn't be the first song, should be the second song after Do You Remember the First Time, was inspired by a real life event. First premiered publicly in an acoustic BBC session on GLR, I think, on the 22nd of March 1994, which is, by the way, the acoustic session that's on the B-sides to one of the Common People CDs. Joyriders opens with the line, "We like driving on a Saturday night." And it gets worse from there, but it's inspired by a moment where Jarvis's car broke down, and he was picked up by a bunch of kids. So there's, like, for example, the lines, "We don't look for trouble, but if it comes, we don't run. Looking out for trouble is what we call fun. And we can't help it if we're so thick we can't think of anything but shit, sleep and drink. And we like women, up the women, we say, and if we get lucky, we might meet one someday." And that's the world that many people, certainly then, lived in, gangs of kids, bored out of their minds, driving cars. There was more than one fatal car crash amongst the kids at my school when I was growing up. Going around, driving cars, talking to women, because there's nothing else to do. You couldn't get the internet or anything, so you'd go out and you'd be bored and you'd have a drink, you'd try and chat people up and you'd drive, and sometimes you'd crash the car or you get chased by police. That was the world that you lived in, and if you were me, you were therefore kind of almost sometimes there's a car park and suddenly there were cars going vroom vroom at the top of their voices. 11, 12 o'clock at night, doing 100 miles an hour in a beat-up area, police chases, all that type of stuff. There's that kind of angry undertone that exists in situations like that comes from a combination of poverty and anger driven by thwarted ambitions and dissatisfaction with a world where if anyone can be a millionaire, then why can't I be one? All those elements confluencing together, and then you end up seeing on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because it's been a couple of NOTCASTs since I've mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You kind of look at that and go, right, so you've got self-actualization at the top, and maybe you've got like things like having a house or whatever, and then there's like food, clothing, sex, cars, violence, religion, injustice and death, those type of things. And if even some of those basic needs aren't necessarily being met, then you end up with a kind of angry undertone, which I saw on Friday night when I was walking home. Is going past a pub and some guy hit a woman, and there were loads of police around and crying people and telephone calls and all that kind of stuff. It was as dramatic as Beverly Hills 90210, as Jarvis said in his own words, and kind of picked that up also with Lip Gloss, first single from the album, which is second track on the LP there, around, and the idea of Lip Gloss is it's got some of those things which don't always make sense, but when you think about example, the idea of going, you've lost your lip gloss, or you feel like such a fool laughing at his jokes and putting up with his friends and kissing in public, and your stomach looks bigger and your hair is a mess and your eyes are just holes in your face, and it rains every day, and when it doesn't, the sun makes you feel worse anyway. These are lyrics around, for example, being sex as currency, sex as power, pregnancy, relationships, self-idealization, self-identity, understanding who you are and where you are and what you're doing. And as Morrissey said, these are the riches of the poor, but also these are the things which were on a day-to-day basis in people's lives. Nobody cared about calling the occupants of interplanetary spacecraft because that was bullshit. It really, really was. So we had all of that going on, and a sense of that this was actually a record that was speaking, certainly to me and lots of people like me, about the life I lived, about the streets I lived in, the rooms I lived in, the bank accounts I had to live with, those kind of situations. Acrylic Afternoons, third song, marvellous. And at one point, it was head and head between having the His and Hers title track and Acrylic Afternoons on the album, and they chose Acrylic Afternoons. Personally, I would have gone for His and Hers. But both of the songs were very similar in terms of structure. Long, protracted intros, spoken word vocals, a sudden explosion, and then another kind of drift down, a simmering back off the boil. Acrylic being a cheap fabric that was very popular. This might be acrylic, actually, I don't know. I'm certainly not going to take it off and have a look whilst this is happening, despite what at least one of you will probably text me about and say, go on and take your top off. I'm not that kind of boy. But the acrylic is kind of timed in and regarded as like a fabric from the 70s, from a decade that's gone past. You think about the cultural change that happens between, say, 1994 and 1974, 20 years. You look at the things that happen there. So, for example, there's fashions, there's styles. These colours on this shirt, by the way, are not unintentional. I'm wearing some of my more retro shirts for the Pulp issues because I figure, browns, blacks, tans, these kind of things. It looks like 70s wallpaper. And I'm completely on board with that. I like that because actually this is so old now. It's almost fallen out of time into an alternate reality. And you think about the cultural signifiers of what you're dressing, what you're wearing, how you're presenting yourself. By wearing this, for example, especially then, people going, I don't really care about fashion. I'm not interested in, your Nikes and your Adidas and your cars and stuff. I'm interested in something that's a little different. And these are cultural signifiers that come out through these. And the cultural signifiers that display themselves in this kind of hyper stylized photo stroke painting this is not what an average band would look like. If you're a rock band, it's four moody Irish guys in a desert all staring in different directions. This is a hyper realized painting using colours that aren't often seen. Your mustards, your golds, your blue, your dark blues. Bands didn't tend to wear that type of stuff at the time. It's more stylish. It was saying, yes, we're something a little bit different, a different class, in fact. Budum-tish. Track 4 is Have You Seen Her Lately? First you let him in your bed, now he's moved inside your head and he directs all the dreams that you are dreaming. And again, it's a song about temptation and fancying somebody but knowing they're a bad move and going, are you going to resist that? Are you going to succumb to that? What are you going to do about it? Track 5 is Babies. Now, Babies is not on the original vinyl release of the album. I think this is one of the later reissues that has Babies on it there as track 5. This is remixed by Ed Bueller. So it's the same recording but remixed with some overdubs, I think. The original plan, had Babies not been remixed, is to maybe put out Pink Love as a single. Because the studio recording of Pink Love, which, by the way, is track 9 on the album, they never felt it quite achieved the potential that it's got. They're kind of like the chorus of Pink Love lifts up and elevates the song when it's played live. The studio version just doesn't do that. It's not successful. So it was remixed, but the remix has never been issued, and instead the version of Babies, remixed by Ed Bueller, went out as a single. I've talked about Babies in the previous, when I talked about the intro album. It's one of the best pop songs there ever is. In fact, so good that I ended up giving a Jarvis dance guide that I wrote and put in one of the pop fanzines at the time. I haven't got a copy of it to hand, otherwise I'd show it to you. But I know it's real because I drew it when I was young. Younger. And then you've got obviously that line about I want to take you home, I want to give you children, I want to give you babies, yeah, and all that type of stuff. Babies was the biggest single off the album. It was the third single to be released. It got to number 17. I'm going to very quickly point out that is the Sisters EP with a quite potentially explicit and suggestive sleeve. On one of the tracks that's on there, Your Sister's Clothes, is in fact the sequel to Babies. It picks up the story of the characters in Babies a couple of years later. And then we have She's a Lady, which is one of my favourite Pulp songs ever. It might have been the first Pulp song I actually saw on television, because I think they opened Glastonbury 94 with it. There's a lyric about selling pictures of herself to German businessmen. There's that idea of the secret inner life that exists inside everyone. So, for example, there's the inner and the outer versions of people. Certainly I was talking about that earlier. And people kind of signal who they are by what they dress and how they act. But also, for example, and where I was saying British people don't really tend to talk about sex too much, certainly not publicly. A lot of the pulp songs are about the inner life of people, so love, romance, relationships, sex, but in a quite carnal, quite a explicit fashion. And actually, that's pretty refreshing. Most people that like pulp, they're a little bit interesting in that respect. But there's in She's a Lady, for example, it's always the song's about actually the inner life, the inner monologue, the inner sexual identity of someone that on the outside appears repressed, normal, and therefore utterly bloody boring. But it's a great song, and you can dance to it, and it's got a fantastic kind of stylophone section in it, or at least I think it's a stylophone section. I can't really remember. Happy Endings is next, which personally, I think maybe should have been the last song on the album just by the fact that it's called Happy Endings, but it isn't. And that's fine. There's lots of bits around it where it's about your happy ending. The bit where you're together with somebody, you're in a couple, you go off into the future. That's the world that you're going to live in. Obviously, we've got Do You Remember the First Time, which I've talked before, and then Pink Love, which is oh hello, another cat down there. You just heard him. Pink Love was remixed by Ed Bueller for a single, but that wasn't released. Actually, one of my memories of Pink Love is when one of the first times I saw Pulp, somebody threw a pink glove on stage, and Jarvis kind of picked it up and went, "Why have you thrown a pink glove on stage?" I saw that. They didn't play the song, but it was a very interesting little thing that somebody had actually gone and bought a pink glove. And sorry, distracted by a cat. Somebody bought a pink glove and smuggled it into the show. Got close enough into the crowd to throw it onto stage. The band weren't even playing the song. Love hurts, doesn't it? Pink Glove is just wonderful. Again, like this, all lyrics about the inner sex lives of people, which is far more interesting than most lives, I would have thought. The album closes with Someone Like the Moon and David's Last Summer, the last two songs. And Someone Like the Moon is kind of like, I think it's a lovely little soft love song about the idea that the moon comes into a full moon only once every 28 days. And the people that you meet sometimes you have to be quite careful about it. Always should be someone you really love, as another lesser band once had it. That, by the way, I think released Girls and Boys the week before, or it went into the charts the day before His and Hers came out. And then David's Last Summer is I think, I don't really remember much about that song. It's epic, it's dramatic, it closes the album in an appropriate fashion, but the lyrics never really hit me. They never really struck me, so I don't really know what's going on. It's definitely fair to say the sequencing on this album, whilst very good, is imperfect and could be improved. But you see this in the shelves and you're kind of like on the racks at HMV, and it's selling, significant amounts. The band are supporting Blur at the Aston Villa Leisure Centre in Alexandra Palace. They're getting into the charts with, top 50, top 30. And by the time they got to Sisters, top 15, top 17, top 20 songs, is really something where I didn't think it would happen. And Britpop became almost like the start of a wave where the world changed and it became more accepted and became a little bit more tolerant for a period of time. Ultimately, and this is going to sound atrociously crass, I think maybe the rise of Oasis, Blur, Pulp, Suede, in some way changed the cultural homogeny away from traditional American capitalist values into something that perhaps could be regarded as something a little different for a period of time. Not to say that Oasis are responsible for the Labour election results in 1997. It could have been a symptom, not a cause. The last single released from the album is the Sisters EP. Here is one of ye oldie-fashioned CD singles. Your Sister's Clothes features the sisters from Babies 4 years on. Now the younger sibling finally gets her revenge for earlier years. Seconds explore the idea that perfect people are, well, perfectly boring, whilst His and Hers is one man's fear of domestic interiors set to music. And His and Hers, the title track, really sums up the character of the album. Save us from, crimpling sheets, save us from matching bed sets, save us from wet. And when this got to number 17 in the charts, it was long overdue. And there was a bit where even, the His and Hers song itself, which is only a B-side, it's better than some bands' LPs, some lesser lights that they were trying to punt to us at the time. Division 4 Drek, like Menswear, who were bloody awful. There was a lot of shit in Britpop. I'm not going to pretend for a second that there wasn't. There was a lot of shit out there. And His and Hers, the title track, which wasn't even good enough to be on the bloody LP, was better than some of their singles, their A-sides even. But then Pulp never wrote B-sides. They just wrote songs, and some went on the album and some didn't. The other thing that we have is it was about time when Pulp appeared on Top of the Pops singing Babies. Jarvis opened his jacket, and inside it just said, I hate wet, wet, wet. And why did he hate wet, wet, wet? Well, because for the past 16 weeks, a risible, banal song called Love Is All Around by Wet, Wet, Wet had been number one, that appeared in some crappy Hugh Grant movie. A song designed for bored shop till assistants about feeling love in your fingers and in your toes, and people being loved forever, and they always will, and their mind is made up by the way that they feel. There was nothing in the song. It was all surface. It was like somebody had made a jelly baby and turned it into the size of a cow. It was horrible. It was guileless. It was unintelligent. It was asinine. It was so sweet it would give you diabetes just on its own by listening to it. It was an appalling, stupid song. And Wet, Wet, Wet had the absolute balls to rip off the REM arrangement on the B-side of Near Wild Heaven, including the extra backing vocals that aren't on the original studio version of Love Is All Around, I don't think, which were created by Mike Mills, and turning those backing vocals. So remember, an REM B-side basically is what they covered and turned it into a number one for 16 weeks. I hate Wet, Wet, Wet. And this was not too far away from the time that Everything I Do It For You by Brian Bloody Adams was number one for approximately 72 years. It was boring, so boring to live in a world where for like a third of a year, the number one was Wet, Wet, Wet singing about love in your fingers and toes. Where a third of a year, it was Brian Adams singing about love again, this time tied into a film about Robin Hood. It was tedious. Life's too short for that. It really, really is. And now, admittedly, we get a new number one every week and nobody knows who the number one is. But I'd much rather have that than to, have a song be at number one longer than the length of the 100-Day War. Which is absurd. A third of a year is a long time. I could have got together with somebody and split up with them in the time that Love Is All Around was number one, and given some of my relationships, that's definitely true. The band continued. They weren't giving up at this point. They knew they were on the crest of a wave, and they were going to take that, and they were going to make that happen. They recorded a Peel session where they played 3 new songs, recorded Underwear, Common People, and a track called Pencil Skirt. They played festivals, Glastonbury, Tea in the Park, Reading. I supported Blur in America. And when they played Reading, they played a new song called Common People for the very first time, which was going to be Pulp's biggest hit, and the subject of the next time I talk about this incredible band. After supporting Blur, they ended the His and Hers era with a one-off show at London's Drury Lane, supported by Menswear, one of the worst bands on the planet. And they also played a song called We Can Dance Again that they never released during the band's lifetime. They were nominated to win the Mercury Prize, and they lost by 1 vote. And they lost to the fucking M people, who nobody remembers and nobody cares about these days. Pulp were better. And frankly, you and I both know it. In the same way as when you think about some of the Oscar winners and you go, there is no way that song should, or that album or that film should have won an Oscar, because it's simply not good enough. Just Google the Oscar winners over the past few years, or the winners of the Mercury Prize, and a £20,000 check, by the way, and then just go, yeah. Sometimes the public get it wrong, and that's how it is. But at last, the world was starting to catch up with Pulp. His and Hers is an amazing album that was a real friend to me and has aged very, very well. And I'm very glad that it happened. And I love Pulp. Always going to. Never going to stop. I mean, obviously, Jarvis Cocker, me, and Stephen Fry are probably the 3 finest living Englishmen. And that's okay. I can live with that. I can live with being at number 3. Because to be fair, Jarvis is probably better than me, and so is Stephen Fry. And of course, there are a couple of other Englishmen that are pretty amazing as well. I'm dad to 2 of them, but that's a story for another time. So, just remember, in the last words of Oscar Wilde, either these curtains go or I do. So stay beautiful, beautiful ones. And I'll see you soon. There isn't going to be a NOTCAST until at least Wednesday now. I'm seeing a gig on Tuesday, but I'm not out 5 nights in a row. So hopefully you'll see a few more of these coming up. So you can't always be common, but we can always be people. See you later. Bye.